Good day, everyone. My name is Rebecca Lilly for the International Association for Energy Economics. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar entitled, What Can We Learn from Model Comparison Exercises? Insights from the EU and US. We are grateful to our moderator, Michael Bucksteeg, for today's timely discussion. First, a little bit about the International Association for Energy Economics. We are the largest association specializing in the field of energy economics and provide a forum for the exchange of ideas, experience, and issues among professionals interested in the field. The organization produces 2 professional journals, a newsletter, and holds conferences and virtual presentations, along with a host of other products and services that you can find at our website at www.iaee.org. If you're not already a member of the association, we welcome you to join. A few housekeeping matters in regard to today's webinar before I hand things over to our moderator. First, this webinar is being recorded for those that cannot participate in today's live event. If you have questions for the panelists, please click the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window and type your question. We've allocated time at the end of the webinar to read and answer them. And now I would like to introduce you to our moderator, Michael Bucksteeg, member of the board of and CFO of the German affiliate of the IAEE. Michael, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rebecca, for introducing. And I will also share my screen to give you a short introduction. Yes, so here we are. So in today's webinar, we are going to talk or learn more about the lessons learned from model comparison exercises. And here we will have a look at insights from the EU and the US. And so actually, what is the background from our side, so from the German side? So we will actually have one presentation on results from one German model comparison experiment, MODEX-POLINS, which is actually a model comparison project focusing on the analysis of policy instruments. So what is special about this? Here we do not only compare the models based on harmonized scenarios, but at a further level of complexity by introducing different policy instruments. And here we actually see 3 experiments focusing on 3 different policy instruments. So coal phase out, CO2 pricing, which is my colleague Oliver going to present today, and one further experiment on integrated heat and electricity systems. And the MODEX-POLINS project was funded by the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action and was part of the German Model Comparison Initiative, MODEX, with actually 40 participating models. And in today's webinar, we will have 2 further presentations to actually broaden the perspective. One presentation given by Matteo, who will actually introduce a framework to compare energy system models. And then we will have the US perspective presented by Candice. And then finally, the perspective with a focus on carbon pricing in Germany and the European Union presented by Oliver. We will try to keep in the 30 minutes that we actually have set to ourselves, and then we will have 30 minutes for discussion to actually discuss your questions and discuss the questions that we have amongst each other. So with this brief introduction, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Matteo. He's a senior researcher at Eurac Research in Italy and has worked on several projects in energy system modeling, and his expertise varies from the development of algorithms for energy system modeling to the analysis and visualization of high amounts of data. And today he's going to present the results actually from 2 projects on providing a framework for classifying and comparing energy system models. So the floor is yours, Matteo.
Thank you, and thank you for the kind introduction. And yes, I'm sharing my screen. Can you see it, right? Okay. Yeah, so this is my presentation on classifying and comparing energy system models. So why comparison of energy system modeling is very relevant, is important to add the robustness, transparency, and reliability to the results of the modeling, and in this way to better support the policymakers. Before to start, I would like to give some definitions, which I will be used during this presentation. The first is about the word framework. So I will refer to the word framework to describe a modeling environment with a general formulation which is replicable under different assumptions and input data, and which is characterized by certain mathematical formulation and structural boundaries. A model, an energy system model, is a specific implementation of an energy modeling framework. A scenario results is the result of an energy system model run. Yeah, the slides and the material that I'm going to present are from two studies. The first one is about the classification and challenges of bottom-up energy system models, where the scope was to identify a classification scheme and the challenges of these kind of models based on a qualitative approach. So the models in this publication have been compared based on their theoretical characteristics and features, while the second publication on the right is still under review, and it's about the comparison techniques of energy system frameworks, models, and scenario results, here with a more quantitative focus. So talking about the different comparison approach, so we have seen the qualitative approach, which is basically, as I said before, based on the comparison of the theoretical characteristics and features, while the quantitative approach is, of course, mostly focused on the results of each framework, model, or scenario. And usually a different set of indicators is used to analyze these final results. And these indicators can be classified in different areas and categories. And we have done this classification in this work. I don't have so much time now to go into detail of all these indicators, but we try to propose a scheme in order to make this classification easier. And then looking at the literature, we have also identified an additional approach which we called quantitative plus approach, where each result is not only compared against a set of different indicators, but also the deviation of the results is further analyzed through statistical analysis, clustering, and so on. So talking about the first study, so the qualitative approach for comparison of energy system models, of course, there are many, let's say, categories and features that can be identified in this regard. So, for example, we have the general approach, the static short-term models versus long-term models, the energy sectors covered, the geographical coverage, the temporal resolution, the methodology and programming technique, and all, let's say, different categories and definitions through which it's possible to classify this kind of models. And in the same article, we have also looked at the challenges of energy system models, and we have identified one which is, let's say, from our perspective, very important, which rotate around the concept of resolution, and we have identified different fields. So the resolution in time, in space, in techno-economic detail, and sector coupling. And we have also defined different levels for this kind of resolution, concluding in that article that, let's say, one of the challenges of energy system models is to reach high resolution simultaneously in all these fields. Then focusing on the quantitative comparison techniques and looking at the comparison of models of frameworks and of scenario results, we can see some differences in this table. So in the case of models, we have just one framework and different models developed from this framework. In the comparison of frameworks, instead, we have different frameworks that are compared. And in the comparison of scenarios, we have, of course, different scenarios obtained by different frameworks and different models. So if we look at the harmonization required in the three categories, we have that in the first one, in the comparison of models, we have the highest degree of harmonization because we have the same input data and also the same mathematical formulation. In the comparison of frameworks, we have the same input data, but we have different mathematical formulation. And in the comparison of scenario results, we have different input data and different mathematical formulations. So the results of the comparison are useful to inspect which aspects. In the comparison of models, mainly this kind of techniques is applied in order to inspect the impact of the resolution. In the comparison of frameworks is mainly the impact of the mathematical formulation and also to identify in the final results the commonalities and areas of disagreement, while in the comparison of scenarios is mainly the common elements and areas of disagreement of the final results. So these results for the comparison of models are very important for modelers, in the comparison of frameworks, mainly for models and policymakers, while the comparison of scenarios is mainly for policymakers. Then in this article, we have let's say we have done a study of the literature of the different articles using a comparison approach and for frameworks, and we have classified these different studies based on the comparison of the comparison approach of the indicators adopted, so the different areas and different categories that we have defined before, and also the quantitative plus approach and the techniques that have been adopted in order to implement this quantitative plus approach. But I don't have time to go into detail of this table, so I would like to focus on the comparison of models. So in this case, we have identified that the most used indicators are in the area of energy and the economy, while less used are in the area of environment and the computation. And the most used indicator are the cost deviation, then followed by the generation and demand direct comparison, and then the cost to direct comparison, and so on. We have also, let's say, collect all these indicators. So this is an example for the cost deviation and the generation and demand deviation. One interesting thing is that for all these indicators, there is the need to define a reference model, which is usually the model implementing the highest resolution. But in the case of the misallocation metric, there is no need to define this reference, so this reference model. So this is also quite interesting. And then we have looked at the same studies to understand which kind of resolution field they were inspecting, they were examining. And this is the final result. So we have that, let's say, the majority of these studies implemented studied just one resolution field, and the majority is about the resolution in time. When we have less studies focusing on two resolution fields, and the most used are the most analyzed are the resolution in time and resolution in space and resolution in techno-economic detail, when just one focusing on the three resolution fields, and no study has been found in literature about these four resolution fields identified in the previous article. But I come to the conclusions, and so through these two review studies, we have worked and we have tried to identify the techniques used by researchers to compare energy system frameworks, models, and scenario results with a qualitative and quantitative approach. And then we focus mostly on comparison of models, and we have seen that the indicators used mostly used are the cost deviation and the generation and demand deviation and simple comparison. And we have also seen that the comparison of models is mostly used to test a certain resolution, and the mostly test is the temporal resolution. However, no study explores simultaneously the 4 resolution fields, so in time, in space, in techno-economic detail, and sector coupling. And this is very important to understand what are the benefits in terms of computational time and, for example, of decreasing a certain resolution and the impact on the accuracy of the final results. And yeah, so that's it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you very much, Matteo, for your presentation. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask the questions in the Q&A. Actually, we will try to answer questions of understanding, let's say, on the fly in the Q&A. And we will actually then continue with the second presentation, and will also collect further questions for the discussion session. So our second presentation will be given by Candice Henry. She's a senior researcher or senior energy researcher at RTI International in the United States, and her work focuses on understanding the interactions between climate variability and power generation. And she led a model experiment comparing 4 US capacity expansion models using highly simplified scenarios, and will present some selected results in the following. So the floor is yours, Candice.
Thanks, Michael. Let me share my screen. Can you all see this? Good, okay. Oh, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, sorry. Okay, thanks everyone. My name is Candice Henry, and I'm gonna be talking today about a model benchmarking effort across 4 electric sector models of the United States. Just some background, as you all just heard Matteo talk about, and I'm sure most of you are aware, there are many electric sector models created to answer different types of questions, and they have different resolutions and input assumptions. So in this figure on the right from Okonomu et al., you can see that there are, even just within power sector modeling, there are models of different temporal resolutions, power system detail, and even among models that are designed to answer the same type of questions. So for example, within just the planning capacity expansion models, or just within unit commitment and economic dispatch models, you can get lots of dissimilar results, even among these models. And this is because primarily of differences in terms of parametric uncertainty, as well as structural uncertainty between models. And for some basic definition, parametric uncertainty we're talking about here arises with the use of diverging input parameters. So this is what Matteo was talking about in terms of scenario inputs, some of your actual cost assumptions, technological assumptions that you put into your model. And then structural uncertainty stems from differences in how the models represent the different components of the power system. So how are the models mathematically formulated? And before I move on, for this work, we focus on understanding the parametric and structural uncertainty specifically for capacity expansion models. So we don't focus on unit commitment, economic dispatch, and power flow models, though I'm sure there are certain similarities across all of these through the findings. So in terms of capacity expansion models, previous model under comparison / benchmarking efforts have been unable to fully disentangle parametric from structural uncertainty. This is primarily because these models are large and complex, and it's incredibly time intensive to be able to disentangle why there are differences between models. But we would argue that understanding these differences is extremely helpful, because they help us more fully understand why there are different results across similar models. So the objective of this specific paper that I'm presenting here is to use highly simplified scenarios across four capacity expansion models of the United States to demonstrate the type of knowledge that we can gain from model benchmarking. So for example, what types of structural uncertainty exists when we eliminate all parametric uncertainty. And the objective is not to prescribe any certain model structures as being better or more representative of real systems, but it was to initiate discussion among the modeling team about why modelers made certain choices about model implementation, and to kind of get the ball rolling on more efforts in this space, and to sort of share why we think this is a really important effort. So the team that participated in this research were researchers across 4 models from 4 different institutions across the United States. This work was able to be conducted in the way that it was because the authors that participated in this effort were the actual developers of each of the models. So we were able to really get into the nitty-gritty details of how our models worked because it was the developers of these actual models. Okay, so the approach that we took was we took our relatively more complex representations of the US power system and we made it as simple as we could before we even did any sort of comparison. So what this meant was we actually made all of our models into single node systems just for this initial comparison effort. So that meant that there was no transmission in between regions across the US that's represented. It was literally just like every region was optimized together as if it were one system. We also selected a subset of technologies. So we only looked at natural gas, nuclear, solar, wind, and battery storage. So if the models had any other technologies represented, we just turned those off. We also assumed that these models would be building on a greenfield site, so there was no existing infrastructure. It's building completely from scratch. And lastly, we ran the models as just 1-year hourly simulations. So there was no actual capacity expansion other than building new capacity on a greenfield site. And there was no retirement constraints at all. And by making the model really simple, we figured that this was a good way to make sure that additional model assumptions that might exist in terms of like what some other technology costs might be or something, those wouldn't be captured in this. And we could really, really drill down on the structural differences between our models for these 5 technologies. With this model simplification, we then input harmonized data into all 4 models, and these were across 5 different cases. So in the first 2 cases, we examined all 5 of the technologies that I mentioned. And then in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th cases, we examined a subset of these technologies. And we input across these models the exact same cost data, as well as some technological details like battery efficiency, decay rate, et cetera, as well as discount rate for the system. And then we also put in the exact same demand, solar, and wind hourly time series into the model so that there would, we're like really controlling for all of the inputs we can. There's not really any room for additional parametric differences. And I will just make a note that case S2, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail, is a purely hypothetical cost case. This case was designed to have every single one of our 5 technologies get dispatched at some point in our model. So these cases aren't necessarily meant to represent any sort of real world anything. They were designed for us to be able to identify differences between the models. And in order to compare across the models, the 3 metrics that we looked at were the total system cost, how much generation and storage was built, and then we actually looked at the hourly dispatch profiles as well across all these models. And the way that this process worked, it was very iterative. So each of the teams would put the inputs into their models. We would all post our outputs on a forum, and then we would look through the differences and then come together as a group and discuss, okay, why might your model have this difference versus our model? And then we did that iteratively multiple times to sort of tease out interesting differences that we weren't expecting per se. So you can see here, this is an example from case S2, that one that I mentioned, where it was really meant to try to, get all technologies to be deployed. But you can see this is the system cost output from each of the 4 models across each of our iterations. So in the first iteration, 2 of the models were actually quite similar, but the 2 were quite different. And through this process where we came back together and discussed as a group, we were able to converge our results to have very similar system costs. And what we found, some of the differences that were really interesting that we weren't expecting across the models were, the specification of various technologies as baseload or load following generation played an interesting role. So nuclear, if it is run as dispatch, you ended up building a lot less of it than if you specify that it must be baseload. Constraints on the state of charge of storage at the beginning versus the end of the model period also made a difference. So in some of the models, they specified that the battery must be at 0 charge at the beginning of the model run, as well as at the end of the model run. And what that meant was that it required more time to charge up in the initial hours of the system of the model run, and that ended up resulting in different battery capacity than the models that didn't specify this constraint. The application of the battery round trip efficiency was a really interesting difference that we noticed. We had told all the groups 85% round trip battery efficiency. But in the groups that applied the round trip efficiency on energy entering the system, their batteries ended up being smaller than the groups that had specified that battery round trip efficiency be applied to energy exiting the battery. And then finally, the treatment of discount rates and the time value of money ended up impacting the system cost of the models as well. And so I just want to reiterate, we're not saying that any of these model choices are better or more representative, but these were just really interesting differences that we had not thought about at all when we went into this. And the fact that these were structural differences that could lead to different outcomes was something that that was a new learning for us. Okay, and so even though it kind of looks like at the end of our 4th iteration, our models converged, they actually don't perfectly align. And so we had remaining model differences across our 2 models, or sorry, across our 4 models. And we pinpointed 2 potential causes for this. The first is that differences can persist if there's no actual unique solution in the decision space of the cost minimization problem. So in this figure on the right, this shows the hourly dispatch profiles across our 4 models for like a randomly selected 10 hours across our model run. And the dotted black line is the electricity demand. And so what you can see is across all 4 models, at some point after the sun sets around like 7 p.m., battery storage is being discharged to meet demand. However, in the hours leading up to that, when the sun is actually charging the battery, the profiles across the 4 models look quite different. And this is because in our system, we had said solar and battery have 0 variable cost. And so the system just sort of is able to charge and discharge randomly because we didn't have constraints on that. And so this is one potential difference across the models that would lead to why we still had some remaining differences across our 4 results. And then the second potential difference is that very surprisingly, the precision with which model parameters were specified can create differences, especially in knife edge cases. So in case S2, which I was saying was the case that we created to really let every technology get dispatched at some point, we saw a really dramatic manifestation of this. So we ran case S2 in just one model with 3 levels of rounding precision, with cost parameters at float precision at 4 decimal places and rounded to 2 decimal places. And across these 3 runs, we saw that total system cost actually increased 4% when we moved from float precision to 2 decimal places. And then we actually saw that 350 gigawatts of nuclear was built with float precision and no nuclear was built with two digits of precision. And this was across just one model. So this is like the same model taking inputs at different decimal precision. And so in certain cases, what this is saying is that in certain cases where we're looking at knife edge results, you have to be really careful in terms of what your input assumptions look like. Okay, so to conclude, what I would say is the main things we found were, of course, both parametric and structural differences can contribute to divergences in model results. But this isn't a bad thing. The modeling community can increase confidence in modeling results through a more systematic analysis of these differences between models via a community-wide model benchmarking effort. So we are really pushing for more groups to benchmark their models to really understand why there are differences. And of course, reporting of uncertainties through sensitivity analyses. This doesn't happen super frequently, I would say, in the modeling community, where we report a lot of sensitivity runs in our papers. And so that is, I think, something that would be helpful as well. I will say, of course, benchmarking will be much more difficult for more complex models than what we did here. But we believe that breaking comparisons down into smaller cases, like unit testing and programming, can make this a lot more approachable. And then I'll end with something that I've said the whole time, but I'll keep reiterating. Differences in model outputs, if adequately documented and explained, can be an asset to the broader energy community because they reflect real differences of opinion between model users about cost projections, technological assumptions, and more. So we're not trying to say that we should not have lots of different models. All of our models should be the same, but it's important to understand why they are. And with that, I will conclude.
Thank you very much, Candice, for your interesting presentation. You're a bit behind the time, but yeah, actually I propose to move on with a third presentation given by Oliver. He's a research associate and PhD candidate at the H2020 School in Berlin, and his research focuses on the economics of flexible electricity demand in the context of sector coupling and variable renewable energy sources. And he is involved in the German MODEX-POLINS project and will present results from the second model comparison experiment, as mentioned before, which focuses on CO2 pricing. So the floor is yours, Oliver.
Thanks for the introduction, Michael, and thanks for the preceding presentations, which I think I can very much build on. And as you rightly introduced me, Michael, I will rather present results than the process, but let me say in the beginning, I very much liked, Candice, how you explained the process, because much of this we have experienced this in our project, but let's discuss this later. So here we're turning to a bit more complex comparison of electricity system models within a real-world setting of evaluating the impact of carbon pricing on power sectors. Yes, so, and it's carbon pricing within the context of the European emission trading scheme, which is the oldest and the largest emission trading scheme. So there are many studies on this, and there are many different results from these studies. So we have the same question as you mentioned earlier, Candice. So how much of this is parameter uncertainty, how much is model uncertainty? And we see that some parameter uncertainty that is in the studies presenting sensitivity runs with this one model, but here we are really aiming for a comparison of different models using harmonized input parameters. But as you may imagine, it's impossible. It has been impossible for us to like really match every single number we put into our models. So yeah, that's what we're trying and trying to make a contribution, and we're focusing on the power sector. So I think that's quite comparable. Yes, we use the ETS as context, but here we are using the ETS price, the carbon price, as an exogenous input to our power sector models. We get the power sector emissions as a result. In reality, of course, we have a cap and trading scheme that would evolve. The price would evolve in the market, but here we're taking this complexity apart in the very first place. So the setup is actually 5 different models participating in this experiment from 5 different developers. So also, again, the developers participating with their own models in this comparison exercise. And here we actually take, and that's the major difference because between the models, we are comparing different model types actually. So we have these dispatch operational models, 2 of them, which fix capacity and then just optimize the dispatch. Then we have one with dispatch and investment. So there's some planning involved, some investment decisions involved, but it also includes the then existing capacity, which is already there in our scenario horizon. And then last, we have 2 more models with dispatch, investment, and decommissioning, because as I said, we're calculating how much capacity is left just based on lifetime expectance of the current power plant stock. And then here, these 2 models also consider taking them out of operation based on economics, based on the market. The scenarios, we are calculating 2016 as a point of comparison, and then 2030 with different carbon prices. And we're really interested in this response to carbon prices as a policy question. And here I'm listing some of the other inputs that we harmonized for our models. And I think it makes sense to, if we're interested in this effect of carbon prices on power sector emissions, to think what actually is the causal path that we want to see in our models. And the first is really the most direct thing we can think of is increased carbon prices will increase the variable cost of fossils, and there will be a fuel switch between different producers, and that will lead to a reduction in power sector emissions. But there are 2 more, maybe less obvious, but still in some models incorporated causal paths, which are through the increased variable cost of fossils, we will change market prices, and that may, in the long term, in the planning perspective, lead to an increase of value of renewables and therefore increased capacity investment in renewables and a reduced margin of coal, maybe, and therefore decommissioning of coal-fired power plants. And that's differently incorporated in the models. So we would expect only the first path to be apparent in the dispatch models. And then if we include investment and decommissioning, we are expecting to see more of a emission reduction in these models. And with this hypothesis, I can now show you our key result, which is here the carbon emissions from power production across 26 countries in the EU ETS. And here we have sorted the different models by their model type. So you can see the dispatch models on the left, then the one that also includes investment decisions, and then we have the investment and decommissioning and dispatch models on the right side. And we see that, and that was somewhat surprising to us, that even at a low carbon price of only 27 euro per ton, we see substantial reductions in emissions, which is partly due to some also policy constraints on building more renewables. Yeah, but we also see a large variation between the results. And it's as expected that those with in endogenous investment and decommissioning, they show a larger reduction. So even with this low carbon price, we see some investment in renewables and decommissioning of coal-fired power plants on a market basis. And that's increasing as we increase the carbon price. So we see a larger variation in the results. We see in the dispatch models a reduction of 100 megatons of carbon emissions when increasing the price, and that's really the fuel switch. So the first causal path, which we see there in these models. And that's also quite similar between the two dispatch models. And then we see about twice of a reduction in carbon emissions in these in investment models here on the right side. And there we see additional capacity adjustments, so investment in renewables, decommissioning of coal-fired power plants. And then lastly, at the very high carbon price, we see somewhat smaller further reductions. We see almost the same reduction across the different model types, actually, but we see here some heterogeneous amounts of carbon emissions from coal-fired power plants left, and that's really related to decommissioning and also to combined heat and power. So some of the plants are, by assumption and by how the model is working of the different participants, they are just staying in the system because they have to deliver the heat, not only the electricity. So here we see some additional complexity and some parts that are not fully harmonized across our models. So let me conclude. We see in 2016 quite similar results. In 2030, we see stark model differences, especially at high carbon prices. That's of course something that should be taken into account when we see that model-based policy advice is given. So part of this it will be influenced by modeling choices. So they should be understood and also clearly communicated. Some of this, and I think here we also matched the earlier, what has been said earlier, there's no better model, we think, but it's really about how are we thinking of markets to work, for example. So will we see perfect investment and decommissioning based on market prices in equilibrium as we have that in the endogenous investment decommissioning models? Or will it be more of a myopic approach and more of the capacity that is there now? We can expect that to be somewhat sticky and stay around until 2030, even if market prices may incentivize things differently. We see the role of combined heat and power, which is something we further analyzed also in another paper. And well, in the end, this, and in addition, the investment in renewables, that's really what drives the effectiveness of carbon prices. So we really also have a policy conclusion from just comparing these different models. Michael already said we have two more papers, so I can leave it here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much, Oliver, also for giving your presentation. We can now open the floor for your questions. So please don't hesitate to type your questions in the Q&A. And maybe to start, one question from my side. I think we got a quite good impression on the work that Candice did with colleagues for the US capacity expansion models with highly simplified scenarios. So actually quite reduced resolution, reduced to one node. And then we had the European setup in Oliver's presentation. So quite complex resolution in terms of spatial resolution. And actually also Matteo gave or actually mentioned this aspect in his presentation. And one question here would be, so why is actually the study of the impact of different resolution levels particularly relevant for energy system modelers? So maybe Matteo, could you give an impression on your view with regards to the resolution levels?
Yes. Yeah, from my perspective, I think that it's let's say very relevant for different reasons. So the first one is let's say it's important to understand let's say what is the trade-off between accuracy and computational time. So what is the by lowering a certain resolution field, what is the, let's say, the gain in terms of computational time which is saved, and what is the impact on the final accuracy of the final results. And this information is very important for modelers, particularly because in order to understand which resolution field should be prioritized compared to the others, and yeah, so I think this is let's say a very relevant point, and is mainly of interest for modelers more than policymakers or decision makers.
Yeah, thank you very much. Maybe one connected question before picking up the questions from the audience. So Candice, Oliver and I, we briefly discussed this before this webinar. So as in the US experiment, the focus is on highly simplified scenarios, and then we actually consider quite complex scenarios. I was wondering, yeah, if simplified cases or simplified scenarios are actually suitable for identifying structural uncertainty, in particular regarding real-world interactions between, let's say, markets, technologies, or elements of the power system. So maybe Candice, if you could answer.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's definitely something that we've been thinking about a lot, because of course, our models don't represent any sort of, at the simplified state that we were running them at, they don't represent any sort of real world power system. But I guess the reason we took the really simplified approach, and I think there's validity in it, is that unless you can start from a very narrow scope, it's hard to, you're just going to assume that any differences are just due to model complexity. And it's really hard to figure out what any differences between models would be if you don't start from a narrower scope. So I think the work that we were doing is definitely not intended to stop at the really simple cases. It was like a first, let's get the ball rolling effort to show that we could even pinpoint differences in really simplified scenarios. We were expecting to go in there and get exactly the same results the first time around. And so I think there's something to be said about, starting with if you're trying to look at some of the interactions that you just mentioned, Michael, starting with simpler cases to see if there are individual structural differences just among those, and then start to add in more complexity in a really systematic way to be able to figure out, okay, at what point do the differences really start to emerge? And I think doing something like that can really help the community build more confidence in our own models.
Yeah, thank you very much. I don't know if Oliver wants to add on this. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe first let me just describe how we did things somehow similar, but also somehow differently. So first, we also, it hasn't been visible in my presentation, but we also had this iterative process coming back with our results and then seeing how different they are. And then we kind of came from the other side, like top down, saying, well, we see these differences in a certain technology, in a certain, and then we were hypothesizing what could that be, why could that be, and then we decided on implementing some changes, doing some further harmonization. So that was large part of our work was harmonizing data, and then we came back again and we're like, okay, yeah, now it looks more similar. So that was the first thing. Or second, can we explain the remaining differences? So as you could see in my presentation, we were like, okay, yeah, there is a difference, but that's due to renewables or combined heat and power and so on. So that's how we approach this. And I was wondering, so now comparing these two approaches, how was it with your project, the after process? So what's left? Did you really change some implementation in your model that are now there to stay for further projects? What do you do with the learning now?
For ourselves, I think there were certain model choices that different groups made that we were like, okay, yes, we like the way we did it. That makes more sense. For example, I think one of the differences I mentioned was the specification of nuclear as baseload, and that was something that our group was just using price to control for it. So, you know, if variable price is high enough, then it will basically behave as baseload. But that is not necessarily how the real system works. And so having an actual specification of, hey, nuclear needs to behave as baseload regardless of price, that is an interesting choice that I don't think every single group needs to agree. But I think the main point is that we were able to identify certain differences and either be like, we think that we did you know, the way that we wanted to, or okay, I can see why there are other options, and maybe that's something we want to consider. So yes, we definitely learned from this, but I'm not prescribing any approach as better than another.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think there are some questions in the Q&A, and actually one question from Tim Mount that is related to, let's say, the topic of complexity. So the question is if any of the models focus on making demand more responsive to the realized amounts of renewable generation. So maybe for our model experiment, we actually neglected a demand response in our model to simplify here. So we ignored, let's say, technologies making a demand more responsive. And yeah, maybe Candice can give an impression about her model experiment, and maybe also Matteo has information about the studies that he looked at, or he and his colleagues looked at within the projects that he presented.
I'll just quickly say we don't look at that, but I do think that is something that's quite important. It is, you know, a component that's being more and more frequently adapted to models. Again, our models were super simplified, and so we just took exogenous demand as an input, but I do believe that that is definitely something that should be explored more in future work that hopefully builds on this type of benchmarking effort.
Thanks.
Yeah, maybe I can add something also here. Yeah, I mean, demand response is very important to be included in this type of models also, and could be classified following our scheme in the resolution in techno-economic detail. And yeah, so as I said, let's say one final challenge of this type of model could be to reach high resolution simultaneously in all these fields. So not only the temporal, which is the one mostly studied, but also others like resolution techno-economic detail.
Yeah, thank you very much. Maybe one further technical question, I think mainly to Candice. So question regarding storage and batteries, high levelized costs. So what about technology innovations in storage and impact on baseload as we look at 10 to 15 years? Is it the duration of usage of batteries or the time horizon? I don't know, but actually a question from John Valentine.
Yes, I'm trying to understand this a little bit. So I do agree that storage innovations will probably impact how, of course, storage is integrated into the system. I'm trying to imagine how it would be integrated into a model, this type of technological change would be integrated into a comparison effort like this. And I definitely have to think about that a little. That is a great question. I don't, if Oliver, Matteo, others have thoughts as I'm trying to think on this.
Maybe this is also a point for, let's say, further research. And I think there is one question from Hannes Blum that also relates to this point. So since you reviewed a broad range of models, can you name what are the still open issues and challenges the community should focus on in the future? So maybe mainly a question, of course, to Oliver and Candice, but maybe also to Matteo.
I mean, Matteo has probably reviewed most of the studies, but from our study, and I actually wanted to mention that before when we talked about demand response, you said, Candice, it's added more and more into the models, but at the same time, I would say how it's implemented is very heterogeneous, like from model to model or from technology to technology. So some demand response, I think, it's very generic. Some is like really tailored to electric vehicles and so on. So I think that's really where model innovation is happening, and where I think there can be done much more in terms of comparing the different approaches. But there has also been done something also in the MODEX, in these German large and many different model comparison projects. There was something on this, but that's something I'm curious to see more.
Yeah, and to add to that, it's not just comparison of how demand response is integrated into a model, but how it interacts with other components of the model would definitely be useful to better understand.
Yeah, maybe I can also say something. Yeah, maybe one challenge in the energy system modeling comparison is certainly the fact of considering whole sectors of the energy system in order to study all the possible synergies between sectors. So this is, I think, also very important. Of course, the work behind in the harmonization of such it's, let's say, bigger and heavier, because there are more input data, more fields to be covered. And one other challenge that I can mention is something that I, let's say, touch maybe very quickly in the presentation. So the use of statistical analysis and clustering on the final results. And this is, in order to achieve that, it's important to have a sample of, for example, frameworks very large in order to have, in order that statistical analysis is effective. And this is very important to understand the deviations of the final results and why these are originated. So why these, let's say, these deviations depends on a certain characteristics of the model or another. So I think this is, let's say, very important. There are few studies, very recent, on this topic, and yeah, but I think this is still a challenge of the research field.
Yeah, thank you very much for your views on this. So actually, there's one interesting question from an anonymous person in the audience. So how social science findings are integrated inside the models, for example, the NIMBY effect or energy cost inflation. So yeah, maybe with regards to our experiments on MODEX-POLINS, so we actually neglected social science findings or impacts of such instruments. Nevertheless, I guess that models incorporated in the model experiment did research on this. However, in the experiment, we actually refrained from such details and interactions with, let's say, actors in the energy markets. But maybe I'm not sure if Candice, or if you can give some perspective on this from the US side.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think one thing that is interesting that's becoming more prevalent in energy modeling is, I mean, right now we've all been talking about optimization-based models, but there's a lot of movement towards more agent-based or other types of models that are able to integrate social science findings and components that aren't just traditionally how we think of techno-economic cost-based modeling. And so this, I'm not super familiar with it. I think it's new to me, I think relatively new in general. But as we move more towards this type of analysis, there's definitely something to be said about further model comparison between power sector models that aren't just optimization based.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I think in the end it also depends on the let's say audience. So if we want to focus on further developing models and understanding, let's say, the structural uncertainty, I think here mainly modelers are the people to address. And if we then think about the policy implications of different instruments and maybe also of social science findings here, then we actually need a broader perspective, I guess. So, but yeah, as time moved on and we are now at 5 p.m., I propose to close this webinar from our side. And I want to thank you for joining this webinar. And of course, also many thanks to Candice for presenting the results from the model comparison experiment focusing on the US. And also many thanks to Matteo for bringing in the perspective in terms of comparison frameworks. And of course, thank you very much to Oliver for presenting the results from our model comparison experiment. And so I would like to hand over back to Rebecca, and many thanks for joining again, and have a nice evening.
IAEE wishes to thank Michael Bucksteeg and our distinguished panelists for an outstanding webinar. This webinar will be available on IAEE's website for future download. If you're not a member of IAEE, we encourage you to join by visiting www.iaee.org. We thank you for attending, and I officially close this webinar.